Welcome to the Building Better Software Teams podcast, where we help technologists in all roles gain influence, expertise, and advancement through team building and thought leadership. From tech stack to team culture, we dig into everything and anything that can help you and your team achieve success. And now your host, Mark Schneider.
We are joined by Rick Luevanos. Rick is the Director of Engineering at Zwift. He's also put up his own website, which deals with a lot of things that engineers will deal with on a regular basis. He attempts to reach out and provide mentorship and coaching to younger engineers who are just kind of getting started out. And so he has a website where he puts out a lot of great material. And one of the major focuses of Rick's site is dealing with imposter syndrome. So we are really excited to have you today, Rick. Thanks so much for joining us.
No, it's a pleasure. Like I said, it's one of my favorite topics.
So let's start with this. Can you tell us a little bit about your current roles? You are Director of Engineering at Zwift. Can you tell us about that and tell us about Zwift?
Yeah. So a little bit on Zwift. I think the best way to describe it is a fit tech esports company where we've married cycling and running with a very immersive video game experience and a robust community. So you can kind of think of the game Sims, except you're training and exercising with friends. And as you said, I'm a director of engineering there, and I came on board about a year ago to kind of help grow the teams. So lately my role's been focused quite a bit on hiring and helping with team topologies and iterating on process and scaling software. But a big part of my role is often having these conversations with folks around imposter syndrome and how well they're doing in navigating the changes in scale that are just been going on lately at Zwift.
Especially with the remote. I assume you assume everybody's remote right now?
We're all remote right now, and obviously not everybody is comfortable with that. Some people are naturals. Some already had the experience. I think remote work was one of those things that was quite jarring to a lot of folks.
So one thing I just want to make sure I touch on, I was reading up on Zwift a little bit before we got together here, and I noticed that, I don't know if you knew this or not, but according to Wikipedia, it says Mark Zuckerberg actually used Zwift for, I believe, rehabilitating after an injury.
It's actually I didn't know that, but I've learned more and more that it's actually a common use of Zwift, especially for cyclists and runners who've recovered from an injury, can't quite get out there and get back at it, and Zwift has kind of served that purpose of giving them a place to train. It's kind of neat, the stories you heard, but I've not heard the one about Mark Zuckerberg. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's what it said. That's what it said on Wikipedia, at least. I think.
Interesting.
Kind of believe that. Sounds like it could be.
Yeah.
So,
yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. So cool. So let me ask this. That's really awesome. It sounds like it's a really great opportunity, especially for you to be able to mentor. What got you into software development? Like, how did you get here?
Yeah, quite by accident. I was exposed to computers early. I had an uncle who worked at Atari when I was very young, and he got me an Atari 800 computer.
Sure.
And the only thing it came with was like a cartridge that just said BASIC on it. And it was like, it was the basic programming language.
Yeah.
And he gave me a manual that had instructions on how to program in BASIC, and I would copy what I was reading and I type it in, and things would move on the screen. And I didn't know that's what programming was. I just kind of tinkered with it. And then I kind of lost interest as I grew up and just kind of dabbled every now and then. But it wasn't until after high school, this was like 94, 95, when I discovered, the web existed. And I kind of, dabbled with HTML a bit, and I just kind of got bit by the bug and just kind of kept self-teaching, kept on going. And before I knew it, I was being paid to build things. So I stuck to it. I think I was very, very fortunate, and it was a privilege to get exposure that early. But honestly, if it weren't for that, if it weren't for the web, I'm not sure what I would be doing. I didn't have a plan. So the timing was perfect for me.
For me, it was a Commodore 64, and almost the exact same story. My father bought me one, and I found the manual. I thought I was just going to be playing some video games or some Hangman on there, and found this book that talked about all these commands that you could issue and kind of orchestrate and make the system do things, and that's what hooked me too. So yeah. As you progress through your career, like what tech stack have you predominantly worked with? Has it been a variety of different?
It varied quite a bit, but when I started out, it was HTML. We didn't have CSS back then, so we got really crazy with tables and stuff like that.
Yep.
And I learned Perl fairly early to kind of do a lot of that, what we would now call back end development. But there was a lot of PHP after that. I did some ASP, did some Cold Fusion back in the day when it was popular. So I bounced around quite a bit. But I also had kind of an interest in design. So, I spent a little time on the UI, UX side of things as well. And I tend to be a little bit, creative just by nature. So, I just kind of stuck with it. As JavaScript became popular, I stayed on top of it. As other technologies became popular, I just kept going with it. And I am what you could consider a generalist. Mm-hmm. And I kind of like it that way. It helps me understand the full stack. Most recently, it's been Python and learning to program in Rust.
Sure. That generalist, I think, mentality is also what I think helps position people into leadership opportunities as well, because I think you kind of have to be thinking about a lot of different things. It's difficult, to lead a team when you're purely focused on the technology. Like you'd mentioned earlier, you have to be thinking about, staffing and mentorship and coaching and progress and projects in addition to the architecture too. So
absolutely. And I think that was the appeal in the beginning to this whole field, was that there are just so many things to get into.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about imposter syndrome. Tell me what you would define it, or what your definition of imposter syndrome would be. How would
sure. Yeah. I mean, if you go to like Wikipedia, there's like a really nice, well thought out definition. But I think in the end, it's really that low confidence mm-hmm. feeling where you doubt your capabilities, you doubt your experience, and usually it's despite all the evidence otherwise. You might have a ton of wins and achievements, but you can feel like, it was all luck, and that you're about to be figured out and called out on being an imposter. It's funny. I sometimes catch myself, even to this day, waiting for employers from like 10 years ago to reach out to me and say like, we've just audited all the work you did for us and realize you were a fraud. How could you?
Yeah.
When in fact, I've mostly gotten great feedback through my career. So it's like a real dichotomy of thoughts and emotions sometimes.
So it sounds like it definitely sounds like you've got personal experience with this. I assume that's what kind of drew you to this topic. At some point, yes. You must have realized what was going on, right?
Yeah, I think I've struggled with it all of my life. I feel like, having been extremely shy at a young age, than just an introvert by nature, it's been easy for me to question my own abilities at times. And, I pay attention to it, I analyze it, and I realize, this is kind of a cycle I keep going through. And maybe, others deal with it maybe once in their lifetime, maybe others intermittently now and then. But for me, it's been quite a repeating pattern, I think. I don't think I've ever been in a role as a developer. This is over a career that spans, 20 plus years, where I didn't go without feeling like an imposter on occasion. And, I don't think it's my own personal experience. I think this includes other folks as well. But like the hardest part can simply be that it creates a lot of cognitive load. Mm-hmm. It takes up space in your mind. It consumes a lot of energy. And I think because of that, as a manager, as a leader, energy sometimes has to be nursed in a way, right? Because you're kind of at the ready. and imposter syndrome being a depriver of that energy, I've gave it quite a bit of focus on how to kind of deal and handle with some of that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent perspective, because I think as developers, that mental capacity, the ability to solve very complex problems,
right,
can easily be inhibited when you're trying to solve another problem, and within your head. If you're trying to justify your being there, that's distracting you and preventing you from being able to really focus on the work that you're supposed to be doing, right?
I feel like, for software developers especially, what you just described, that's part of your job. But your skill set, your knowledge, it can often have like a 2-year shelf life. You're always learning.
Yep.
And that creates ambiguity. So it's not lost on me that, I would meet so many people and speak to so many people that do deal with imposter syndrome on occasion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's the fact that we do have to constantly learn, and like you said, within a year or two, you could potentially be behind on your skills.
You could. Yeah.
That's not to say you can't get caught up, but I think that's the challenge. Is like it's hard to get caught up when you've got that kind of thought process where I shouldn't be here in the first place. How am I going to catch up? It's definitely counterproductive. So one of the things I was reading up on before we got together here is in 2011 there was a journal published, and they called out something really that I thought was really interesting. They said one of the consequences of the imposter phenomenon is burnout, emotional exhaustion, loss of intrinsic motivation, poor achievement, including guilt and shame about success, and it's reinforced by repetitions of this cycle. And you've I think you've defined it, that there's a cycle. Can you tell us a little bit more about that cycle?
Yeah. And I think there's probably a ton of reasons that imposter syndrome can be cyclical. I don't think it's like that for everyone. I think it's different for everyone. For me, it serves as an alarm or an alert that of something I'm going through at a particular moment. So I might be out of my comfort zone and trying something new. Maybe I'm learning something new, and that can raise doubts. It can raise doubts in my capabilities, and that can trigger some imposter syndrome at times, for one. But I think the real cycle for me, especially as I've done a lot of recent learning about myself, is when I'm not working within my style or optimal mode. And I'll unpack that a little bit. I feel like I do my best work when I need to improvise a bit, when I need a quick start on something and build some momentum. And maybe that includes some mentoring and some coaching. Those situations help me build some confidence. And if you imagine imposter syndrome as like a sine wave with peaks and values, when I'm doing these things, I'm at my peak. Mm-hmm. But when I hit a steady state, and maybe I'm focused more on planning or longer term vision, and I haven't needed to improvise or quick start on anything, everything's just kind of moving along, I tend to fall out of my style or optimal mode of working. And I may not realize it. And imposter syndrome, that creates fresh ground for like imposter syndrome to sprout. So I've learned to recognize those peaks and valleys, and that when that imposter syndrome hits, I can stop and ask myself, am I working in my optimal mode? What's changed? Am I out of my comfort zone? And I think just that self-awareness alone, one, obviously revealed the fact that, wow, this really is cyclical, at least for me. And two, it helps me prepare a little bit better.
So you can predict that it's
I can predict. Yeah. I mean, I've actually taken the time to journal and plot it out and realized, oh, wow, this becomes very predictable, at least for me. And for a lot of people I've talked to, actually. And once you know that, it's a lot easier to handle the energy part of it, right? Because it's like being, training for sport. Rest and recovery needs to become part of your training regimen. And just kind of knowing that, I think is part of helping, kind of helps me deal with that cycle.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the things we can do to help others with imposter syndrome and help ourselves with imposter syndrome.
You are listening to the Building Better Software Teams podcast. For more info about this podcast, including episode notes, visit 7samurai.dev.
So we're back with Rick. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things we can do to help others and things we can do to help ourselves when we're dealing with this. So Rick, one of the things you've come up with to help kind of manage that cyclical process is a tool. You call it the Hacking Imposter Syndrome Cheat Sheet. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. And let me give some for some context there, right? Because there are, there's a ton of resources obviously available online now, much more than there were maybe 10 years ago, which is great because it means we're not alone in feeling the way we feel. And there are a lot of folks out there dealing with imposter syndrome. I've done a lot of research there, and I've taken a lot of what I've learned and tried a bunch of things and ended up condensing things into like a few steps that work for me. And I was able to kind of put them all into this acronym I call P.A.R.S.E.R, P-A-R-S-E-R.
I love that acronym, just given that this is focused on developers.
Yeah. And when I came up with it, I was like, oh, this is great. It feels like it relates to software, and that makes it easier for me to remember. But they essentially encompassed the tactics I was using when I was hit with imposter syndrome. So, and we can break it down, right? So P.A.R.S.E.R, the P, it just means pause. I don't want to ignore the emotion. It's hard to get it out of my mind anyways, but I feel like it just grows and gets worse if I try to ignore it. So, I've learned that if I stop what I'm doing and actually shift to giving the emotion a few minutes of my time, let's acknowledge it, right? And that's the next piece, the A, acknowledge. I've paused, so I'm going to give it a small spotlight. But specifically, I'm going to give it a name or a label. And this is based on like some empirical, cognitive research out there about externalizing our emotions and giving them a label, which helps us do that. Mm-hmm. I've gone as far as welcoming imposter syndrome verbally out loud as like Mr. Naysayer or Sir Naysayer. It's like, oh, here you are. Yeah. You're interrupting me. I've gone further than that. Like right now, I have a bracelet on my left arm, and it's got a little tiny Darth Vader head on it. And I've even had a Darth Vader bobblehead next to my monitor. And when I would feel that imposter syndrome setting in, I would kind of look at them. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, here you go. So
you have a visual aid now.
I have a visual aid. It's like, here you go. I'm trying to get work done, and you're starting to nag. But it helps me externalize it. It's not me. It's an outside force, encroaching on my mind. And so we've paused and acknowledged. And then we get to the R, which is, reaffirm. And this is where, and this is probably one of the most important steps. This is where I remind myself of my accomplishments and my wins, the areas where I've succeeded. And I think most of us just don't do enough of this in general. It's just so much easier to remember the losses or the failures. Sure. The wins normally aren't the kinds of things we keep track of. But when I reaffirm, I'll just mentally run through a cycle of some of my achievements, or some of my biggest achievements, or some of my most recent wins.
Do you have a way for you to easily go back and remember those, or is there?
Yes. Yeah. There was an important step. I learned this in working with a coach, and we focused on imposter syndrome for a bit, but the bragging file became a thing for me.
Sure.
Where I started recording and journaling the things that work. It's the bragging file. And this is hard for a lot of us.
Yeah.
It's hard to toot our own horns, but it's a helpful list to have, because you can read through a few of those and you start realizing, wow, I've done a lot. I've accomplished a lot. And sometimes reminding yourself of that is truly helpful.
Very, very rarely do I go look at my resume and update my resume.
Right,
but
right.
I've noticed that, when it's time to do that, I'll go back and look. And a lot of times I've got a lot more detail put together in kind of a master document than I would normally send to somebody. But I get to look through, all of those projects that I've completed and really think back like, yeah, those like you said before, nobody's called me up 5 or 10 years later and said, hey, this isn't working. Like a lot of these things are actually still in use. And that's really a kind of a cool feeling to kind of get you back into that mindset that, hey, I can achieve these things. And
yeah, it's funny you bring that up. I mean, you're absolutely right. Because before I started kind of keeping a bragging file, the only time I would revisit it was when I was redoing my resume.
Yeah.
And if you're at a job you love and you're hanging out for the long term,
you're not looking at that.
You're not looking. Yeah. Cool. And so the next one there in P.A.R.S.E.R is share. And I think with any kind of negative emotion, once you broadcast what you're feeling, what you're going through, that burden of trying not to let others see what you're feeling kind of goes away. Mm-hmm. And you get a little bit of energy back there. But I've also found that, others are really quick to give you support. And most of the time, I'm realizing that other folks are going through the exact same thing. So sharing it, broadcasting it, whether it's families and friends, whether it's on social media, is helpful. Just this is how I'm feeling right now. And most of the time you're going to find, I've been feeling the same way too. And it just helps. It helps to know you're not alone.
Going back to number one, I think the reason you're pausing is because you want to acknowledge that those are valid feelings.
It's normal.
Yeah.
Yep. Totally. It's absolutely normal. And I think nothing wrong with feeling the way we're feeling.
Yep.
So the next step in P.A.R.S.E.R was execute. And this one was important for me because, most of the time imposter syndrome hit, I was in the middle of something. I was taking an action. I was in the process of doing something, and then I had to shift gears because of the imposter syndrome. And the reason I think it's important to acknowledge and remember execute is it's okay to feel what we're feeling, but what we don't want we don't want it to slow us down. Mm-hmm. The point was I'm still going to finish what I was planning to finish. I'm still going to get back to it. And by doing that, I've kind of created this habit of acknowledging imposter syndrome as a very short event and not one that takes away my ability to move forward. It takes away some of the stress and some of the energy loss because when I pause, I know I'm going to get back to it in a few minutes. Mm-hmm. And that additionally makes it okay for me to take that pause because I actually know I'm going to get some energy back and the work I'm about to start doing in a few minutes is going to be that much better because of it.
So it's a worthy investment to just...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah. And then after E, we have repeat, which I think it's kind of obvious, but in truth, I've had to repeat this P.A.R.S.E.R cycle more than once, sometimes in an hour. Sometimes it takes a few attempts before that confidence, builds back up, and that's okay. So it's not like I get imposter syndrome. I go through this P.A.R.S.E.R process and I'm good to go. Sometimes I have to kind of hit it a few times. Mm-hmm. And maybe it takes a few more minutes. And that's okay. So I'm reminding myself that it's okay to repeat the cycle. Sometimes I just repeat it intentionally. I do it 2-3 times and just go through the whole thing. So we're looking at, pause, acknowledge, reaffirm, share, execute, and repeat. And that's P.A.R.S.E.R. And I think the acknowledge, reaffirm, and share steps are probably really the guts of it. Like that's where the work is happening. And that's usually where I start to feel better.
Rick, you're leading teams. You've been doing this for a long time. And you're struggling with this, still. And I think a lot of leaders still struggle with it. They've just developed ways like you have here to kind of manage it. As a leader and having kind of, having this experience yourself, have you been able to kind of use this experience to identify this within those you're coaching?
Yeah, I don't know that I've gotten any better at identifying it. But what I have done has been very, very intentional and specific to the way I lead. So, I think, like identifying that someone might be dealing with imposter syndrome at any given time might be kind of tough. So I put my efforts into creating a safe space for it to be discussed.
Sure.
And the way I do that, it usually means that I talk about it first. So my one-on-ones, whether it's every other one-on-one, every third, whatever it might be, I'll always ask, how is the imposter syndrome going? Sometimes people don't know what that is. and I explain it. And then all of a sudden there's this aha moment, like, oh my gosh, like that's what that is. Like, that's what I'm dealing with. So I've normalized it, right? It's like, oh, this guy with experience who's managing must know it's a thing because he's got a label for it and he's bringing it up. So it's normal now. Other folks, when I bring it up, seem totally relieved.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, thank you for asking. It's been tough for a while. And they start expressing how it's been affecting them. So it's a regular question that I bring up often with everyone. And I then encourage them, check in on other folks around them. Ask them the same question. I think it helps create a safe environment for being vulnerable and sharing what you might be going through, because I don't think that we're always going to be able to detect it. I think folks are good at hiding when they're struggling and suffering, and just asking, hey, how are you doing? How are things? Isn't going to do it, but asking them how the imposter syndrome is going, I think as a regular prompt kind of conditions folks to be a bit more open.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've heard kind of in some other places too that in your one-on-ones, traditionally you've started that with how's everything going, and really what you should do is just level set and start off with everything is not going great. Let's forego the everything. I'm doing fine, because that nobody's doing fine, especially right now.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great approach to kind of say, hey, this is a real thing. I deal with it. Lots of people deal with it. Let's make sure that it's you're understanding that this isn't something you need to feel bad about. We're not going to look at you as you're not productive because you're struggling with something like that, because we all struggle with that. And I think that is kind of the challenge with being in the leadership position is proving to the people that we're looking to coach and mentor, proving to them that we're not just assessing their productivity, but that we understand that
absolutely,
their mental state is important in this job. Your ability to deal with all the complexities of what we're asking you to do, in addition to your own, thoughts and processes, is important.
Yes. Yeah. And I think earlier we talked about, your style and your mode of optimal operation. Not a lot of folks know what theirs is. They haven't figured it out.
Yeah.
So a lot of times the imposter syndrome discussion is a catalyst for, hey, let's learn what it takes for you to be at your best. And maybe you're not in that right now. And we can figure that out together and see how we can recreate that.
These tools are great, and I would encourage anyone who's either in a leadership position, or even if you're just you're just starting out in your career, and I would think even for junior developers, this is an even bigger issue, especially if you're just coming out of college or dev code camp and you don't have a lot of experience. This is probably something that a lot of those folks are experiencing too. And
absolutely,
the reality of it is, if you're passionate about this stuff and you're working hard to learn the different skills that are necessary, you can do this. You just have to, like as Rick said, you have to work through kind of that optimal
your optimal mode of working.
Optimal mode of working. I love that. Yeah, you have to find that.
Find your style.
And
find your style.
That takes time. It takes
years. Absolutely.
So
definitely.
So Rick, I just before we kind of close it out here, I just want to make sure we talk a little bit about your site. That's there's some great articles on there. Maybe just quickly tell us what prompted you to even start kind of writing some of the articles that you've posted on your site.
Yeah, I'm loaded with notes. There's just all this information that I lean on in mentoring and coaching on a daily basis. And I think I'm hitting that mode in my career as many of us do, where it's like, how much can I start giving back? Mm-hmm. And it's like, these are all topics that are help. I use to answer questions on a daily basis with folks. and more people are asking questions. So it's definitely a goal of mine to start broadcasting a little bit more
and sharing
of my own experience, in the hopes that other folks can use that as a stepping stone to kind of achieve their own goals.
That's great. And what is the best way to reach that site?
Yeah, so the site is you can either use Ricardo Luevanos or Rick Luevanos, RickLuevanos.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, at /IN/Ricardo Luevanos, RiCARDOLUEVANOS, and I'm on Twitter at Rick Luevanos. I do encourage folks, reach out, get in touch. Part of my efforts of starting to broadcast, a lot of my experience, I'm gonna be releasing a newsletter here soon called The Rising Dev, where I'm going to share, weekly articles about dev careers, but specifically about rising as a developer. What are the things I do day to day that get me from that junior to mid to that senior role? And a lot of it's going to cover some of what we talked about here today and a few other topics. So I hope to be releasing that in the next week or two.
So we'll make sure to include links to all of those items on the podcast notes once we put this podcast out. So feel free to check those out if you'd like to find more resources that Rick is going to be producing and get on board with that newsletter, which sounds very exciting.
Cool.
I love the name. The name's awesome too on that.
Thank you.
So thanks, Rick. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us.
It was a pleasure, Mark. Very happy to be sharing this information. I think it can be helpful to a lot of folks.
Great. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Building Better Software Teams podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.